get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Center, and I'm so glad that you found us today. Our Teaching and Learning Center has a professional development series that runs every Wednesday at noon, and my colleagues will drop into the chat the information for how you can get a certificate if you'd like, or how you can even become a fellow if you're a faculty or staff member here at K-State. So we're very excited that you're here. I always talk about next week first. Next week, we'll be having a teaching chat. If you've been to a teaching chat before, I'll have some things that I want to talk to you about, pick your brain about those kind of things, but you're also able to kind of bring in any ideas, concerns, questions that you have to share with the group, successes that you've had in teaching, that kind of stuff. And if you want to sit back in the background and listen to the chat, that's fine too. I don't want you to feel intimidated like I will make you talk. I'll give you the opportunity, but I won't make you do anything. And we really appreciate you being here. Today's event, we're very excited. Angie Brunk is an assistant professor in the library. She's an academic services librarian and is going to be talking to us about how to create accessible documents. And we're so excited to have you today, Angie. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Dawn. I'll go ahead and pull up my, let's see, I should be able to share my screen, correct? So I can pull up my, it is behaving, sort of, we'll see. And
I can see your PowerPoint, Angie.
yes. All righty. So we're going to talk today about creating accessible documents. I think quite a few of you know my story that I'm not only was I born with a visual impairment, but I actually went on to get a degree in human factors. So I learned about designing, you know, from the academic side as well as the living with it side. But a lot of you might not know that I'm really a document creation geek. I've taught the basic graphic design class for communication students. I've actually handset typed. So I just love to geek out about document design and typography. So if you're bored someday, just drop by my office and I'm happy to chat about this. So this presentation, you know, I cannot cover everything in an hour. This is just kind of more to give you a taste and to give you ideas of where you might want to go for learning more about this. So we're talking more in this presentation about how do I create a baseline of accessibility so that if I need to modify things, that's going to be easier. Accessibility is a journey. It's not a destination. So what I'm telling you now might not be true 5 years from now. I hope that I look back in 10 years and go, we were telling people that, oh, no. Because we're still really learning and we're still learning to actually do things well. There are definitely still some gray areas, and I'll talk about that a little bit as we get into this. And certain objects might require expert assistance that you don't have. And certainly feel free to identify people on campus who can help you. I really debated how much to include on, you know, how many resources to link to. So I'm keeping it pretty minimal, but if you have questions or you're not sure which resource is a good one to use, certainly feel free to email me and I'm happy to track down, well, this is my favorite color blindness palette, or, you know, this is my favorite guide to making math equations accessible. But I went with a pretty minimal approach at first. So the WCAG standards, yes, they're a web standard, but they're a good guidepost for all kinds of document creation. And especially if you're working in Canvas, the WCAG standards are going to be your gold standard. Campus resources, we have the Student Access Center. They can help you with quite a few things. If it's a basic question about creating a more accessible document, I'm certainly free to and more than happy to help you. So please just hit me up if you have questions, especially of a design nature. Section 508, which is
Angie,
yeah.
I'll monitor the chat for you. So if any questions come up in there, I'll shoot them to you. There is a question about what WCAG stands for.
Oh, web content accessibility guidelines.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, thank you. I forgot to say, please monitor the chat because I can't. Section 508, which is one of the early accessibility standards and is still in use by the government, especially when it comes to education, has a great web page with an overview of accessible document creation, and I've linked to that. And Dawn, I'm happy to send the slides, or I can just put these in a Word document, whichever works for people.
Typically, sending the slides seems to work for people. So if you're willing to do that, we can put those out there for you.
Sure, happy to do that.
Thank you.
And why is this not advancing like it should? Okay. So one of the important points that I want you to understand is there is a gap between compliance and accessibility. The standards and laws are trying to serve two purposes: to make things easy for people to create something, and to make things more accessible for people. Really what it amounts to is playing well with accessible technology. But standards are also going to make it easier for us to do future revisions and things. But because of their nature and because of needing to impose a one-size-fits-all, the laws and the standards don't always work well with actual lived needs, and with actual accessibility and usability. And for me, accessibility and usability are two sides of the same coin. So I'm trying to balance those competing needs, and I'll try to point out where conflicts may arise. And there are a few points, and there are a few discussions I've been a part of that I'm going to try to give you a peek behind the curtain as we move through this. Along with that, user agency is really the backbone of creating accessible content. And I wish more people would look at design from a user agency point of view. That is to say, some people actually need to change things in your document. And the more control that you can give the end user over the final product, the more likely you are to create something that they can actually use. So, for example, some people really need to change fonts or colors. And this can depend on various disabilities. There's a whole host of reasons why people might need to change fonts and colors. More flexibility is going to mean easier fixes later. Like I said, this is an evolving area. This will always be an evolving area. And I'm going to hit on one of those later. One of my pet peeves is the idea that serif fonts can't be accessible. Not true. And I'll talk about that later. But it used to be considered that, sans serif was always better. But the more flexibility you will input into your design, the easier it's going to be to fix things down the road. For the love of everything, please don't give your students PowerPoints as PDFs, from multiple perspectives. It makes it impossible if a student needs to change a font or maybe look at things in a different way. It doesn't give them that flexibility. And I can tell you as a librarian, I have spent way too much time at the reference desk trying to help students print PowerPoints that the professor has set up as a PDF. There might be circumstances where it works for somebody, but it's going to cause more problems than it solves. And at K-State, our students have access to the Microsoft Suite. So just provide the document to them in the original. That's going to solve a lot of accessibility problems. The most important point is to don't break stuff. A lot of products now have built-in accessibility features. All Microsoft products, and I will demonstrate some of this, have an accessibility checker built in. By the way, quick poll, let's see if we can get thumbs up or a yes in the chat. Who has actually used the accessibility checker in Microsoft or knows where it is? especially in Word. So when you're creating a document from scratch, use the features that are in the program. Like I said, I'm a typography geek. So I used to try to set everything very precisely manually because I know what I want and I know what looks good. But that can interfere with some people's assistive and adaptive tech. You can get through some of this, and I will try to demonstrate ways to still make things look good.
Angie, I counted 2 thumbs up and 1 person said yes in the chat.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure.
Well, a lot of people haven't then. So, all right, I'll make sure I'm demonstrating that. So use the built-in header features and bullet list features. I know sometimes initially those don't look the prettiest, but there are ways around some of that. And I'll kind of show you how to do some of that. But use the built-in tools because they're actually designed to put in all the tags and features that are needed for someone who's using assistive or adaptive technology.
And Angie, we have more stuff in the chat. I don't want to interject. It feels rude to do that. Do you want me to just keep interjecting, or do you want to kind of pause?
I'm happy to improvise. So.
Okay. So someone had asked in the chat for you to expand on the myth that PDFs keep students from stealing intellectual property.
Oh, okay. You know, I'm not completely out of sympathy for faculty who are concerned about intellectual property. I certainly have those concerns myself. I mean, the chances of a student actually wanting to steal your slides is going to be fairly low. If it's text you're worried about them stealing, they can still copy and paste that from a PDF. You know, my first thought would be, if you suspect a student of stealing your intellectual property, that there are a lot of ways, you know, we in a university saying we don't have to have recourse to the courts. We can handle that through university disciplinary procedures if needed. You know, if you want to, when I teach, I do talk to students about intellectual property. And that's certainly something that you as a faculty member can do, is to tell students, hey, if you steal this stuff, you do realize that this is a violation of our academic integrity policies, that you will face university discipline. Does that alleviate the concerns that were expressed on, or is there a more specific question?
No, I read to you what the person had said. So there's that. A commenter did say that slides are not only stolen, they are sold to third-party companies which charge other students for assignments.
Yeah. I mean, that can happen just as easily with the PDF though. Putting it in a PDF is not going to prevent that. And I get those concerns. I will say that, you know, copyright law is broadly speaking on your side, and it kind of depends on how much you want to pursue that.
And the commenter agrees with you on that point.
Yeah, yeah. So if you would use alt text on the web for something, use it in a document. So if you have an image in your Microsoft Word document or your PowerPoint, you should be inputting alt text for that. And then Word and all the Microsoft programs do have built-in accessibility checkers. Unfortunately, I do not have Adobe Acrobat Pro, so I can't demonstrate anything with that. But I can tell you that in Acrobat Pro, you do have a built-in accessibility checker, and you have some ability to assign reading order for things in Acrobat Pro. So for example, if you have a document with a complex layout, a screen reader is just going to kind of go through from top to bottom, and that might not be the way you actually want a document read. But there are programs that will allow you to assign that screen reader order. The Student Access Center has something called Equidocs they're only going to bring that out when it's really needed because we have limited licenses for that. But within Adobe Acrobat Pro, you can do at least some of that assigning of screen reader order. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of open source software, of open and alternative textbooks. You know, I'm well aware that Microsoft, Elsevier, and EBSCO, and Gale, and all the other publishers are in fact evil and cause a lot of problems. However, we need to realistically address the elephant in the room too. A lot of the free stuff is very problematic from an accessibility point of view. As much as, yes, those companies are in fact evil, I actually know and work with a lot of the people who are doing accessibility work for the big corporate conglomerates. They have the resources and they know they're more likely to get sued. So they are actually putting in the work to do some really good accessibility stuff. Google Office, you know, Google Docs and Sheets and all that can be really problematic from an accessibility point of view. I actually have fairly low support needs when it comes to reading electronic documents, and I'm very savvy at it. And Google Office is still super hit or miss with me. Every time I get a Google Office link, I kind of groan a little and go, okay, let's see if I can actually read this. So they just don't put in the same level of accessibility effort. And there are some other issues, but it's a problem. That's not to say you should never use it, but you need to be aware of this. And if you decide to use it, maybe take some extra steps. Open educational resources are fantastic. And I'm actually working with our OER librarian to strengthen the standards for accessibility standards at K-State. But universities and other purveyors of OERs are very uneven in their enforcement of standards. So just because you got an OER from a reputable university does not necessarily mean it's accessible. And, you know, they do vary very widely in quality as far as accessibility goes. We're still developing the standards to really ensure accessibility. I mean, there's quite a bit of documentation out there, but I would say we're far from having really solid finished standards that are going to get to the root of most of the problems. And some of our documentation, I think you're seeing a pattern here, is really more about documenting what we've done so that as we understand more and as technology evolves, we can fix any access problems in the future.
Angie, we have a question about creating alt text. Is it preferable to write our own or use the auto creator in Pressbooks?
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great question. My thought would always be to write your own. And that's for multiple reasons. So good alt text should describe an image fully so that someone who can't see or maybe isn't a visual thinker can understand why you thought this was important to include in the text. If you're going to have an image that conveys a certain mood, then that needs to be in the alt text. You know, something that would give me an idea of why you thought this was important to include and describes the contents well, you know, without going into so much detail that it becomes condescending. There are actually instances where it is more appropriate to skip alt text. For one thing, if an image is purely decorative, in which case, why are you including it? I understand visual appeal and all that. I get that, but we want to be mindful about why and how we're using images. I saw the PR for a talk that I gave recently that on avoiding ableist language, and the stock image that accompanied it was just a bunch of people at a meeting. I mean, what does that have to do with my talk? How is this in any way connected? So be mindful of why is that image used, and if it's purely decorative, you can skip the alt text. You want to make sure that you are actually intentionally leaving the alt text blank, which in most cases involves actually entering something in the alt text field. It depends a bit on which content creation software you're using or which content management platform you're using. It's often either 2 spaces or double quotes. That's something you need to look into with each piece of software you're using, but intentionally skip the alt text so that the screen reader doesn't read image. You want to skip that if the image has a good caption, because if it has a good caption, your alt text is often going to be redundant. If the image is otherwise fully described in the text, which is a good idea because people learn in different ways. Sometimes people don't really process the visual information and they just want a good text description, or sometimes having it fully described in the text will reinforce the image or vice versa. So in that case, you would again probably want to skip alt text. This is one of the areas where I was mentioning conflict between actual accessibility and the laws and standards. Because we're an educational institution, the Office of Civil Rights occasionally, and the Department of Education occasionally audits our stuff. When they do so, unfortunately, they don't have an actual human who knows the area and can exercise good judgment really look at the stuff. They use a 508 checker, which is an automated software solution. That will flag missing alt text. And there are plenty of times when alt text would be just really annoying. For example, if we're looking at a staff directory and we have my picture and then my contact information, how annoying would it be to have to sift through several iterations of image of Angie Brunk, contact information? That's not really very user-friendly. But in some cases, you do have to go ahead and use that alt text because we're concerned about 508 audits. But this is an area that I do expect to evolve. So, please keep that in mind when you're designing things. Images fully described in the text can also be acceptable alt text in that particular case. But again, if you have to listen to a bunch of that, that's going to get super annoying. But sometimes it's a balancing act between what we actually want and what we need to do because of standards or legal concerns. Does that answer the questions about alt text, Dawn?
I will say that I cannot speak for the people who asked those questions, but it seemed to me that you covered what you should have covered.
Okay.
Well, permit another question audit-wise, rather than typing and spending all the time typing. This is Professor Nichols.
Okay.
Angie, as you know, we just finished 47. And one of the images that we had some difficulty with was underwater sea cables that can be attacked by China. And we were looking at 300 different cables, which were in roughly 60 countries. We were trying to describe the various target points for the defense of these cables if they should be cut by underwater vehicles. This was not a simple image by any means. Am I understanding you that a combination of alt text, which would be more of a summary than a wide-ranging, here's 300 cables, blah, 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 and a captioning, because we didn't really use the captioning. We used like figure 1 or figure 7.1, that kind of thing. But a captioning with a description of what we were trying to go, plus the alt text would be a balance between that and the overwhelming amount of information that you could give on something like that. Am I hearing that correctly?
I believe so. I would say that, it's always best to look at each thing individually. So I hesitate to comment on one very specific thing, but I would say that overall the idea is correct. Does that help?
Yes, I think I got it. It's a balance to reach the audit position on one side, the legal side, if you will, and the descriptive one for the alternate text and captioning and enough information in the text so that it all makes sense.
Right.
Okay.
Angie,
Yeah.
this is Barbara here. I'm curious to know if one can think about it in terms of footnotes and how we used to use them to further elaborate on something, or in notes, which I don't see as much as I used to see in
Well,
literature.
we use them all the time, Barbara. That's absolutely the way to go. I agree.
I think you're on the right track there. It's been a while since I've seen extensive footnotes in a scholarly work, you're right. But yes, images are usually used to further elaborate a point, and that's what the alt text should do. It should give that flavor to someone who can't see the images. Or maybe someone with visual processing disorders who just doesn't think along the same lines visually. Does that answer the question?
Oh, absolutely. I think the other thing is in a field like mine where it's very visual, you would be trying to describe every last slide that you had in a PowerPoint, but
Yeah.
some of that comes through what you say to support what one sees. We're trying very hard to teach our students to not just say, well, this is an image of, well, most people can see that's what it is, but why is it the example that you're using, which further elaborates what you're saying in notes and alt text would do. So, okay, thanks.
So also when including images, and this is one of my personal pet hates, I'm visually impaired, but still a very visual person. I like those images. Whether they're decorative or further explain the points, I like them. I want to use them. But often I find it's difficult to do so because the images are poor quality, or they are too small, or they don't magnify well, or they're a tiny image with a lot of detail and I can't pick out what's going on. So if an image really matters and you really want people to see it, make sure that you're using something that's high enough resolution that's going to magnify well. I haven't seen really concrete guidelines on this, but what I would use as a rule, and it follows other things in the WCAG guidelines at least, is if it can't magnify to at least 200% of original size, it's not sufficient resolution or quality to really be included. An easy test for that would be when you're working in Word, especially if you have, like I've got a nice 24-inch monitor. Look at the document in Word and magnify your view to page width. What happens to the image then? You can also use the built-in magnification tools in your OS. Every modern OS has them. I mean, if it would be useful to people, I'm happy to show you how to access those on a Mac. It's a pretty similar path on Windows. But you have built-in screen readers and magnification, among other things, on your computer. So test your documents using some magnification and see if your image actually still works then. Fonts, one of my favorite topics. Contrary to a myth that has been spreading for way too long, both serif and sans serif fonts can be accessible in electronic documents. Personally, I love a good humanist hand like Baskerville or Caslon. And that's what I prefer to read on screen. This idea that you should use sans serif fonts comes from the days when computer monitors had fairly poor resolution. They don't anymore. And the old rule used to be that you would use sans serif if you wanted to for headlines, section headings, and things like that, and a serif font for large passages of text. I actually still like those guidelines because for most of us, obviously there are exceptions due to various disabilities, but for a lot of humans, when we are reading, we see the shape of the word more so than we see individual letters. And serif fonts contribute to seeing that shape of the word, and they tend to be less fatiguing to read over the long haul. Now, I'm sure that among you, there is someone who violently disagrees with me, which goes back to my point about user agency. But stick to clean, basic fonts. Know that some users will need to substitute fonts. For example, and as a designer, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to tell all the designers in here, some people actually need to switch things to Comic Sans. It is easier to read for some people with dyslexia and ADHD and other print disabilities. Just because it makes our eyeballs bleed doesn't mean it's a bad choice. So just be aware of that and look at how your document looks if somebody does that. Usually it's not going to be a problem for something you've created in Word, but that's another good reason to make things available in Word or in PowerPoint, is that then allows students who need to do so to change things. I will pause since we're about halfway through and ask if there are any questions that I haven't gotten to yet.
So Angie, there are a couple questions about clear basic formats, in particular asking if NTR is on the list of clean basic formats.
Clean basic fonts.
Fonts, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, do you mean Times New Roman?
I'm reading the question, so I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to see it. But if it's something like Times New Roman, if it's not an overly cute font, like what I have chosen for the header, that's not a clean basic font, but it's a large text. So, you can get away with more in, like, say, a headline or other large text, but that would not be a suitable font for actually reading. What I've chosen for this, like, this is actually the main body of the slides is actually a serif font. Anything that looks like that is kind of what I mean by a good, clean, basic font. Like, don't use Curls MT. Don't use, for the most part, don't use Comic Sans in basic document design, but be aware that some people do need it. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me. There's a question about if there is a preferred size.
That's a very interesting question. If you are designing a document with less than 12 points, you must be either 20 or really like using magnification. I don't know. But as long as you are creating documents in a reasonable font size, like say 12 and up, most people like me, I'll use some kind of magnification. So If I'm looking at a document in Word, I'm using a large monitor and view at page width. And that then automatically magnifies things to what I need. If I really have to use whole screen magnification, then I would step up to whole screen magnification, and that's going to magnify things. But it's always a balancing act. So I always recommend, just stick to, for your large blocks of text, stick to 12 point. That's fairly readable for people with normal vision. It's going to magnify well without having to do excessive magnification for people with, low partial sight or low vision. And then if somebody uses a screen reader, the text size doesn't really matter. Does that help?
The questioner follows up and says that they ask because using larger font in some of their Canvas work, they were told not to use larger than 12-point font or heading sizes because of the magnification.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and it kind of depends on which strategy each person is using, but that's a perfectly logical recommendation.
Thank you, Angie.
Okay. Okay. Color. Your text should be high contrast. Now, again, there's some leeway if you've got section headings or something like that. But make sure that it doesn't interfere with the color blindness, color vision defect. And there are plenty of checkers for that. If you do need to use color in a document, use color blindness and or contrast checkers. And there are several of those that are quite good. Just it's something you can Google and find quite easily. If somebody wants to know my favorite, I do actually have a favorite color blindness palette. I'd have to look that one up. But contrast is really the watchword here. You need high contrast. And if you stick to a very simple color scheme like black and white, it's less likely to interfere with people who need to change color schemes, either for ADHD, which is helpful. It's helpful for some people to change color schemes, or for visual issues. Some people need to read white on black, which I can't read white on black well, but other people with different visual issues need white on black. So the simpler you make your color scheme, the more likely it is to play well if somebody needs to change colors for whatever reason. I would say that we're not where I really like to see us when it comes to math and data visualization. There is some guidance. There's some really good guidance and things are getting better, but it's still not where I would like to see it. If you're going to be using equations, you want to be using either MathML or LaTeX to really get solid text, especially if it's something that you're looking at exporting to the web or exporting as a PDF eventually. Trying to get things to play nicely. Again, especially if you're looking at transitioning document formats, can be really tricky. So when you're thinking of how much prep time you need to make a document, build that in if you're needing to put in a lot of equations. There's some really good work on making data visualizations more accessible, but I would say that's very much in its infancy. And it seems to be either you have perfect vision or you're blind. There isn't nearly as much work as there needs to be for people like me who sit in the middle and need some visual assistance, but can still see. If you're working with students who need it, I'm going to promote the library right now and point out that we can 3D print data visualizations and graphs and things like that that can give students a way to feel the graph tactily which can be a great way to make sure it's accessible if you have a blind student or a student who might need that tactile input for other needs.
So Angie, there's a question about some of the software packages you were mentioning. Someone said that latex does not work well, especially with higher functions where even a space can cause junk in the equation output. How is MathML in your opinion, and are there any other tools?
So I will flat out say this is not my strongest area of expertise. It's an area I'm going to end up learning a lot more about because our open education resources librarian and I will be further developing the standards for our OERs here at K-State, because that is exactly what we found, is that latex causes problems when you try to translate something into PDF, which is what I was referencing about things not playing nicely. MathML is more pure HTML. And so sometimes that can be made more readable. So much of it here depends on your document format. So I don't have a really solid answer other than it depends, and we'd have to look at each individual case. Sorry. Were there other questions?
I think we're caught up for now. Thank you.
Okay. So another quick, give me, and Dawn, if you can count for me, give me a thumbs up if you know about Read and Write Gold, and especially if you have used it. I'm not seeing any on my end. Are you seeing any, Dawn?
Angie, I saw one thumb.
Oh, one thumb. All right. All right. That's more than I thought. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of Read and Write Gold. This is a free download. If you have a K-State EID, you can get this for free. Read and Write Gold has a lot of accessibility features, and trying to demo that over Zoom is always super dodgy. I'm going to try, but it can be really problematic. But I really encourage you to download it and play with it yourself. When I was first introduced to it years ago at another institution, I was in the room with a lot of other faculty, and I heard a lot of, wow, I really wish I'd had this when I was doing my PhD. A lot of the tools in Read and Write Gold would actually be great for helping faculty organize their research. So it's a great tool for everybody to play with. It can be used to generate pretty solid optical character recognition text from documents that were not originally screen reader friendly. Like if you have an old PDF of an article, and one thing to understand about PDFs is some of them do not have optical character recognition text or text searchable. And a lot of people are not necessarily aware of this. And if a PDF is rendered in that way, it is not usable by screen readers. It's almost impossible to search for text within it. But a lot of older articles, you know, some of the early stuff put online, some of the early stuff in our databases is actually rendered that way. And that makes it nearly impossible for a lot of people to use. But you can take that PDF through Read and Write Gold and actually generate the OCR text and generate a better PDF that is going to be more readable. And it's a pretty quick and easy process. I don't know that I'll try to demo it today, but I kind of have some things set up so that I can. You can also, and Read and Write Gold, according to Jason Maysberg-Tomlinson at the Student Access Center, can actually read some stuff that you would be amazed at. Like they've taken old mimeographs even and have managed to get usable OCR text from that. So that's definitely something to be considered. You can also use it, and I was having a hard time getting this one to work today, because of course it's not going to work the day I want to demonstrate it. But you can get Read and Write to find text in graphical images. Like say you have a comic or a graphic novel that you want to use in class, but you have someone who needs the text. You can actually use Read and Write Gold to pull out that text and generate a PDF. It's got built-in screen readers. It has built-in highlighting and masking tools, which are used commonly by people with ADHD. But you know, if you're having a hard time focusing, those tools can help you as well. I think a lot of people, if they knew about it, would find something that they could use in Read and Write Gold. So I would really encourage you to download it and play with it and see what tools you find useful. I think if we're looking at some of the more basic skills classes, like maybe Comp 101, or some sort of entry-level writing class or entry-level research methods class, you could even integrate Read and Write Gold into your classes as a tool to help students keep track of and build their research. Okay, so what are the tools and support available to you on campus? The Student Access Center can certainly help with a lot of this. I can help with a lot of this. You know, if it's a more basic question, you're just trying to do basic accessibility. You're not asking about a specific student accommodation. I cannot help with that for a whole host of reasons. But if you're interested in document design for usability and accessibility, I am more than happy to help you. So please contact me, and my email is in the slide. So before I try to, okay, I need to stop sharing this. Okay, there we go.
So Angie, there's a question about, and I believe this is for Read and Write. Is this available through library services, or do they go online to access?
You would go online. It's through the software downloads for K-State. I can find the link if somebody needs it. I can find the link and send it to you, Don.
Okay.
But it's through the standard software downloads available at K-State.
Okay, we can, and if you get us that information, we can share it out to this group.
Okay.
Thank you,
So,
Angie.
do I have more questions before I make everybody's eyeballs bleed for a moment?
I think again, we are caught up in the chat.
Okay, great. Okay, so yes, I know this is terrible. It's intentionally terrible. So if we go into this is in Microsoft Word. I just took an abstract that I previously done and made everybody's eyeballs bleed for a moment. So, like I said, there is a built-in accessibility checker. And now, Dawn, I cannot see, because of my Zoom, I can't see. Can you guys see the report from the accessibility checker on the screen?
Yes, so we see the inspection results, that warnings, it's hard to read text contrast.
Right, which is what I would expect. Now, I'm going to fix that because really this color combination should never happen, but you know, some people do around Christmas time. All right, so color, I am going to switch back to black. And I'm going to check accessibility again. And is that popping up for you guys?
I do not see an accessibility warning or navigation screen. Okay, now we do.
Yeah.
It says that no accessibility issues are found. People with disabilities should not have difficulty reading this document.
Right. Now, like all automated checkers, you know, it's a place to start. if you have something really complex, you should probably have a knowledgeable human look over it. But for basic stuff, this is going to catch most of it. And it's an easy step to take to establish that baseline of accessibility. Now, if we get back to some of the things, okay, let me see if I can make this go away. So if I'm going to create headers and things, I need to be using the tools here. If I'm going to create a bulleted list, the same thing. Use the tools here. Don't try to type it in manually. This will put in the appropriate metadata to allow someone who uses a screen reader to actually hear what you meant them to hear. I will, okay, I see where we're at time-wise. All right, let me see if I can get this to behave. Okay. All right. So now I am going to, is my read and write goal showing up? Okay. I'm gonna give it one more try to see if I can get the toolbar to show up. Yeah, I don't think this is going to work over Zoom, so I'm not going to try to do too much, but I can at least talk a little bit about, now this is, my office mate made me an intentionally bad PDF. So thank you, Dan, for doing that. But there are a couple of things wrong with this. One of them is not necessarily something you can fix, but it's something you do need to look out for and maybe use a different text or find a different version. This book was probably rebound at some point, and in the rebinding process, the text block was cut a little short and it was bound tightly, which is why we have this gutter issue. This is not something I can fix, but I can fix the fact that Dan intentionally just had it take images of the pages instead of doing that OCR scan. That's something that can be fixed with Read and Write Gold. If nothing else, can everybody see the puzzle piece that says R&W? That is your Read and Write Gold toolbar. And oh, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I'm not sure I see that, Angie.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think it's going to work over Zoom. So I'll just stop sharing for now so that I can like see who's been here the whole time or somewhat see who's been here the whole time. And in the last 7 minutes, I would like to hear any more questions you have or comments or observations or challenges you found in the classroom with creating accessible documents.
Angie, why can't we use combination of technologies, especially on these harder images or these latex mistakes, I'll call them. For instance, if I'm trying to read, I have a blind daughter, and so I've been doing this for quite a few years. Why can't we use sound? People learn things different ways, as you know. And for somebody who's visually imaged, sound tends to be, visually disabled in a sense. Sound tends to be, or touch tends to be, well, we can't touch anything with the word, but sound tends to help. So if we were describing an image, and what we do in our books is they're literally audio books, is there some reason we don't have a tool that would, for an image, the alternate description being both a visual, which is screen reader, and a little clip or something that says, this figure is blah, 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 and here's what it's trying to show you, that kind of thing.
Right. So actually, that gets into some really interesting territory, and it gets into a major project I'm working with colleagues at Penn State. sometimes providing an audio first version is better depending on the disability. Now, for students with dyslexia, ADHD, or another print disability, you still want screen reader friendly text because reading and hearing helps reinforce their understanding. Because, remember, not all screen reader users are blind. And not all visually impaired people use screen readers. I've seen some people use pretty extreme degrees of magnification because they don't like screen readers. So the decisions a person makes about the assistive or adaptive technology they use are very personal and they vary quite a bit. Having said that, that's a great idea. And there are some various projects that are working along those lines to create better accessibility. A lot of it boils down to what's available with the particular platform that we're using, what's accessible to the student, what do they have the software to read, and just trying to get everything to play nicely together doesn't always work super well. I will say that some digital library software has the ability to produce audio files from scans, and I have used that before. And actually in a lot of our databases, at least some of the articles have a built-in read aloud feature or an audio version that you can download. Does that get to what you were asking?
Almost. That's a really good answer. So one last follow-up so I can let the rest of the people here have their say. We're using Pressbooks for number 8. We're already starting on the 8th in the series. And unfortunately, it's going to be another technical one. We're talking about space and everything from weapons to agricultural uses and so on. I suspect we're going to have some of the same problems we had with the number 7.
Right.
What does Pressbooks have, I guess, because that's our tool for what I understand we've been using it for.
Right.
And it exports very well to other formats. I like that. What tools would you recommend to use in Pressbooks? And then I'm going to shut this thing down. Thank you for letting me speak. I appreciate it.
Okay. So I am still learning about Pressbooks because originally I wasn't part of my job description, but there's a need, so I'm evolving in that direction. And we have frankly had a hard time getting some answers out of Pressbooks that would have been helpful. So just stick with me on that because it's an area where I'm going to be evolving and learning more. Okay.
Does this mean I have to plan an extra month of accessibility into the project?
Hopefully just 2 weeks.
Now, that's what we said last time. I'm going to plan in a full month.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. All right. Do I have other questions?
I do not see further questions, but I do want to thank you for taking all of your time today to share this content with us. Thank you also for being willing to share your slides. We'll make those available to people who are here today and who are watching this later. So thank you so much, Angie, for your contributions today.
All right. Thank you.
For those of you in our series, we have the opportunity for you to complete a post-event survey. My colleagues have just dropped that into the chat. I'll remind you that we do the professional development series every Wednesday at noon. Next week, we'll have a chat, which is a little bit more kind of open conversation about lots of different things. And the week after that, we'll have our next plan presentation, which will be on, so a marginalized student walks into your classroom, which will be a discussion on inclusive teaching by Trevor Bell from the Psych Sciences Department. So look forward to seeing you next week and then, and thank you again so much for your time today. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.